Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Queens of Bohemia and other misfits. The story begins in 1920s London at a time when women's rights were surging after the long battle for suffrage, and nightclubs emerged as spaces where single women could socialise unchaperoned. What could possibly happen next? Well, the man who can tell me all about it is the writer Darren Coffield, who has written the book Queens of Bohemia. I'm delighted to say he joins me live on the line from somewhere probably in Bohemia. Darren, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Are you actually in Bohemia, that well-known province, sort of Eastern Europe somewhere?
I'm just on the fringes.
Right. Okay. On the fringes of Bohemia. Now, that I would like to buy a duplex there. I think on the fringes of Bohemia, you could just wear a sort of anyway. Yeah. Let's tell me a little bit about. Good morning to you, Darren. Tell me a little bit why you're so eminently qualified to write a book about the Queens of Bohemia and what actually this means. Because we're not talking medieval history. What are we talking about here?
We're talking about sort of the mid-20th century, really, towards the end of the 20th century. Just about a time when people realised that there was more to life than just drudgery and work. And they decided to actually write their own script, so to speak, and live the kind of life they wanted to, rather than the life that everyone else expects them to.
This is the jazz age, isn't it? I suppose you can say, and many of the listeners will think, oh, okay, so it's the jazz age. So we're talking Great Gatsby, and we're having champagne in Long Island, sort of millionaires' mansions. But for ordinary people in London or in the UK, it was also a time for change, but maybe not as ostentatious, but still, they were discovering, as you said, a time to have a good time.
Yeah, and also the whole world had changed. I mean, for example, women's underwear had become much looser, so they could actually dance on the dance floor, which people sort of don't forget that kind of stuff. But the 1920s was a dance craze. It was the time when people could actually go out and socialise and meet one another quite openly in public, and they could sort of engage with each other. But there's also people around like Marie Stopes, who's about to set up the birth control clinics, and all sorts of things were afoot. So on one hand, you had people like Tallulah Bankhead, who's very, very famous for her very louche and sort of sex symbol lifestyle, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But she'd be socialising with someone who's promoting, childbirth, pregnancy things. So
there's an interesting one, because if you say sort of the sexual revolution and women's liberation, everybody go, okay, it's 1960s, it's the pill. But actually, it's actually happened sort of 40 years, 50 years before that.
Exactly. I was starting off writing a book about the 60s, actually. I interviewed Peter Cook's wife, Wendy Cook, and several models who were around in the 60s. But then I realised I couldn't explain going through until I explained what the 1920s were and what happened in the 20s. Because that's really where it all starts from, that whole sort of lifestyle. And
of course, we tend to take it for granted now, but it's the women's suffrage movement in the 20s. Women had the vote now for the first time in under a decade, and we take it for granted now, sort of 100 years later. But at the time, that's a groundbreaker.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And also the fact that they could actually go out and do things by themselves, because beforehand it was just merely a life of domesticity and drudgery, really. There was a certain things that were expected for women to do, and they weren't really allowed to do anything else. And what's fascinating is how they ended up running most of Bohemia. I mean, all the famous bars, all the famous clubs were all run by women. And it was the women who really made it all happen, but they seem to have been written out of history.
Why were these clubs sort of run by these exotic women rather than perhaps over in the States where it was run by organised crime figures, basically? Because I know they had prohibition, so it's a different thing. But at the same time, it's still an interesting thing that the women should take charge in running these clubs.
Yeah, I mean, basically they were very, very good at hosting them, and they had the charm and the style to run them. And also, as a woman, you could get away with saying things that a man never would. So if a man said a certain thing to a man to put them in their place, it'd probably end up in a fight. Whereas if a woman said it, they would just be humiliated and have to put up with it. And these women were very, very tough. I mean, some of them had nicknames like the Tiger Woman.
Yes.
And they certainly had earned those nicknames because they'd been in fights with razor gangs and things. So that's how they got their names.
In fight, it was like sort of Peaky Blinders meets, I don't know, Madame Jojo sort of situation.
Yes, on steroids, yes. And much, much more dangerous. I mean, to run a business then as a woman, I mean, all sorts of people would be trying to lean on you and exploit you, as you said. I mean, organised crime, all sorts of things. But these women were incredibly tough. I mean, including during the war, some of them, like Annie Allchild, who run the Coach and Horse in Soho, her husband was away trying to find whiskey to sell to GIs. So she was just basically left running this pub in Soho that was absolutely full of American servicemen who were just having punch-ups every night. You know, she had to try and control it all.
So what are the landmark clubs then? And we're talking about the Soho region then in London. In this is your Bohemia, yeah.
Yeah. So where the film industry had moved to Soho in the 1920s, the British film industry. So suddenly Soho goes from being a slightly sort of seedy area to going quite upmarket. So you'd see film stars and actresses turning up to Soho for the first time and intermixing with artists and poets and writers and singers. So it was a real cast of characters all together. And so the first club that was really famous was the Gargoyle Club,
right,
which is where lots and lots of people hung out. And then after that, there was the Colony Room Club run by Muriel Belcher, which was the famous post-war one.
Yeah.
And so these clubs interfitted with the local bars, because at that time you couldn't actually drink anywhere between 2 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon because of prohibition. So lots of these clubs run sort of afternoon drinking hours for people who just didn't want to stop drinking. And they had that kind of lifestyle where work ended at noon and they just went off partying from sort of midday.
Well, I mean, whereabouts? I mean, because for those who are familiar with London, that particular thing. I mean, the Gargoyles, is that Dean Street? Is it Frith Street? Is it Rupert Street? Where was it? Old Compton Street? Whereabouts?
Yeah, so they're most of them are around Dean Street, funny enough. And even nowadays, the Groucho Club's on Dean Street, isn't it? So there's always been that sort of pull to the area. I mean, the Gargoyle Club was huge. You had to go and take a lift up to it, which meant it could never be raided by the police. Because the man downstairs, the doorman, would press the bell and everyone would suddenly stick all their drinks up their jumpers and lose them because it was, they weren't supposed to be drinking after 2 a.m. in the morning. They all had their own sort of strange peculiarities. And they all sort of basically had their individuality from the women that attended them and ran them. And no two places were quite the same. And there's also, to go along with the sort of nightclub culture, was an entire sort of cafe society for people who didn't really want to drink, like Quentin Crisp.
Yes.
And so there's a whole cast of characters like Quentin Crisp and Ironfoot Jack and the Countess, who was an incredibly posh woman who'd fallen on hard times and ruled the bins of Bond Street. She was basically a very, very, very dapper, very posh bag lady who spent her entire life sort of rifling through bins to find what she could sell to make money out of.
I mean, you mentioned the Coach and Horses, which many people will know from, I don't know, Geoffrey Barnard as Unwell, and the famous Norman, was the landlord there for ages. I mean, so that appears in the story. I mean, places like, I don't know, a Blue Post, French House, Quo Vadis, are they around this time, or is that later on?
Yes, they are. Yes. Yeah. So I mean, the French House originally was run by a German called Mr. Schmidt. Because when the First World War happened, obviously Mr. Schmidt was quite happy, really wanting to sell up and leave, the amount of aggravation it was going to cause. And so as a Victorienne, his wife, they run up and down the street trying to collect £200 to buy the lease off the German guy. And that's how they took it over. And then it became known as the French House because of all the French expatriates who drank there during the war. And famously, Charles de Gaulle wrote his speech that he delivered to the French after the fall of France from the French House. So there's this kind of very sort of exotic kind of background to do with all the immigration, the Italian community, Greek community, French. I mean, everyone who was all kinds of different blends of people came together. And of course, you could buy food there then that you now take for granted. You can buy in any high street supermarket. You have to go there to get anchovies, olives, olive oil, all these things now you can just stick in your shopping basket without thinking about. You had to go to Soho to get them. And that's where, there's all these sort of wonderful food stores there as well.
Yeah, the markets and stuff like that, yeah?
Yeah. And so, it wasn't just a place to source contraband and sort of do naughty things. There's also a place to go and get your ingredients and cook, exotic meals.
I think it's really, really fascinating because, I mean, Soho, and I spoke to a friend of mine called Guy Hamilton, who was part of the Save Soho campaign about a decade ago now. And but there is, I mean, it's been taken over by, if you like, corporations, and there seems to be a Starbucks in every bleeding there still elements of that looseness? There's still the echoes of that looseness going around, Darren, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it still goes on. I mean, obviously there's Soho House, which is the latest big development in the area, isn't there? So you've still got that sort of pull where you've got film stars turning up and people flying in from LA. I think one time I remember Bill Clinton turning up at the Groucho Club and having to step over a man in a sleeping bag who was sleeping on the street outside. So you still get that kind of pull, but it's always had this sort of mythology to it and a sort of sense of romanticism. But the flip side is the horrible side to it all, really.
No, yeah.
People who are really on their uppers who don't have 2 pennies to rub together, living cheek by jowl with rich, very, very rich people.
It's the thing about those people with, very grandiose titles, but absolutely nothing in their handbags, because they are sort of, and obviously loose behaviour. There are confessions of an opium eater going on. There's all sorts of very, very strange things being read, all sorts of exotic herbs and spices being sampled, shall we say? And also, again, I'll drop the W word in, even though we're talking 100 years ago, because people are like, it's a modern invention, this wokeness. But we've got gender fluidity here as well. Because people think the flappers, and it's all very sort of Charleston and the whole thing. But flappers and the Gargoyle Club, they're places where women can, those who want to indulge in relationships with the same sex or whatever, or just cross boundaries, years before Ziggy can do so.
Well, what really made them so controversial is that the women cut their hair short and looked very boyish. I mean, the whole point of being a flapper was their profile was very, very flat. They used to, they didn't have any sort of, obviously, they would sort of tie their breasts down, so to speak. So they looked very androgynous, like boys, really, in skirts. And that was all part of the controversy of it all. They were known as crop heads because they cut their hair so short. It was a sort of derogatory remark for them. And so the men looked very, very flamboyant. They sort of looked dressed like Augustus John and sort of grow their hair long, whilst all the women were having their hair cut short. So they were playing around with the ideas of what was acceptable and what made a male or a female. But it wasn't like nowadays when it was so highly developed now. Everyone sort of argues about it all the time. Then just the sheer sight of a woman without not wearing a hat was enough to make people faint. With polite women never went out in society without a hat on. And there's a funny story in the book where the artist Walter Sickert sees Nina Hamlet as another artist stumble out of a pub with a pint glass in her hand without a hat on, and he almost faints at the shock of it all.
and showing, first of all, it was showing the ankles, and now a hat. What's becoming to this post-Edwardian society?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's interesting because they really were testing the boundaries, but I think they weren't doing it so consciously as people are doing nowadays. I mean, there was definitely no money in it. I mean, being controversial like Tallulah Bankhead, it got her fame, but if anything, it kind of didn't help her career at all. So she ended up doing mostly stage work instead of film work. I mean, she started off as quite a high-paid film star, and towards the end of her career, she ended up appearing on Batman in the TV series in the 1960s as a villain.
There's nothing wrong with the 1966 Batman, Darren. You know that.
No, it's true.
Exactly. But again, we're talking about the cast of characters because they are absolutely brilliant. But Isabel Ralston, now that sprung to mind, and so that caught my attention because, quote unquote, artist, spy, model, pornographer, and more. Now I know. Yes. People in Spain are probably on their third cafe con leche, but just explain to me a little bit about what Isabel was up to then.
Well, Isabel went to art school, and then whilst she was at the Royal College of Art, she started to model for an artist called Jacob Epstein, who was then one of the most famous artists in England, the most controversial. And she fell in love with Epstein, ended up having his baby. Then Epstein had the baby taken off her. And the baby was brought up as Epstein's own kid and went on to become a very famous racing car driver in the 1960s. But in the meantime, Isabel ran off to Paris to get over the doomed love affair and the loss of her child, and sort of fell in with a guy called Sefton Delmer, who was the chief correspondent for the Express. And Sefton could speak fluent German and had already interviewed Hitler and people. And Sefton's friend was a man called Ian Fleming. And so that's how she sort of fell into that world. And she knew Ian Fleming very well. And during the war, they escaped with the help of a man called Donald MacLean, who later became famous as a double agent as well and defected to the Soviet Union. And when she arrives in London, she wants some war work to do. So they send her off to a secure area out near Bletchley with her husband, Sefton Delmer. And they basically make what they call black propaganda. Yeah. So they produce sort of radio shows in German going on about what that nasty Mr. Hitler's been doing and things like this. But also Isabel ended up making pornography on behalf of the British, which was then dropped on the Germans, thousands of leaflets. What? And the Germans thought it was actually so good, this pornography, that they copied it but put English words in it, dropped it back on the English. So there's a very, very funny sort of setup going on.
There's Black Ops and there's Black Ops. Why would dropping a bunch of porn on unsuspecting Nazi Germany have any effect, Darren?
Well, the idea was it's supposed to demoralise the troops because it was supposed to show the Germans what was happening to their wives back at home. whilst they were away on the front. But the Germans thought it was so great they dropped it back on the English. And I think Sefton Delmar said that they couldn't get enough of the leaflets in the British Army. He said not because they were worried about distributing them, but the men just like to read them.
One of the things that just blew me away from that monologue is the way that it's all interconnected, because he just dropped. I mean, apart from Epstein, I'm going to ask you who the famous racing driver, because my father was a racing driver in the 60s, so therefore I'm interested to know who the racing driver is.
Jackie Epstein.
Right, fair enough.
Yeah.
But also the way they're all interconnected in terms of so and so knew Ian Fleming, who knew McLeod, and it is that, isn't it? It's we talk about social connections now, but back in the 20s and 30s, it really is an interconnected world.
Yeah, I mean it's a big world, but it's also quite a small world, because the kind of people who want to hang out in nightclubs and dance all night long, I mean they're quite a small group of people at the end of the day. There's probably 400 or 500 people who are doing that in central London at that time, week in, week out, and also going to the Ritz and places.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, there'd be thousands and thousands of people doing that. So it was a much, much smaller world. If you was into Bohemian circles, sooner or later you'd bump into someone or meet someone who would be of interest to you, or vice versa. So it's interesting. They're all interconnected, but it's not a deliberate thing on their part. They're not networking like nowadays.
You mentioned Quentin Crisp, obviously naked civil servant, from then on. And you talk about the Gargoyle Club. What are the reactions? Or is this if you can, we'll use some woke. Is this a sort of safe space then, Soho or Bohemia, for those who, for queer, gay, whatever you want to call them, people, so they can go to the Gargoyle Club? I mean, you mentioned that femme fatales can quite happily sort of search for other women there. Was that sort of was it accepted within that sort of area that you could get away in a way that from the norms of society you couldn't do if you were in Rochdale or something?
Yeah, and also there was a thing with the rich, where the rich would actually go out to Bohemia and sort of laugh at the people and the way they behaved. A bit like the Victorians would go to a mental asylum and laugh at the people who are insane on a Sunday as a sort of form of sport. You'd have women walking around in ball gowns and men in top hats who'd just come back from the opera wanting to go and laugh at the Bohemians. It became a thing to do. So although some people thought that they were living a great lifestyle, to other people they were derided and laughed at. But it's interesting. I mean, for example, there was a sort of Welsh mafia. There was Nina Hamnet, Dylan Thomas, and Augustus John all came from Wales, and they were all sort of the top of their game, really. And they were all hanging out at the Gargoyle Club as well. So it wasn't just about being gender fluid or crossing the lines of class. It was also about people coming from the suburbs or other parts of England or the UK where they felt they could meet kindred spirits. So it was a bit like Paris was, where people came from all over Europe to Paris in the 1920s. Just to find kindred spirits, people who had a similar outlook or to them.
Yeah,
that's why people came to Bohemia in London.
And also, you mentioned Dylan Thomas there, but you've also mentioned the Colony Club as well. So an awful lot of heavy drinking going as well.
Yes, I mean it wasn't. It's not a book for good parenting. It's quite shocking what some of the people get up to. It's mostly neglect, but I mean some of the kids, so even though they come from incredibly posh families, they're completely covered in lice and they're completely, neglected. Really, nowadays it'd be called child abuse.
Because there is this underbelly. I mean, you can say it's all very glamorous, and we're all lying in the gutter, darlings, but some of us are looking at the stars. But I mean, it is a case, isn't it? I mean, there are some very sad stories in this book. There are some sort of like moments. Yeah, I mean, there's some serious casualties come out of it, really. And people were very naive about what they were doing. I mean, it didn't occur to anyone what alcoholism was. If you said to Dylan Thomas he was an alcoholic, he just wouldn't get it. He wouldn't even know how to spell it, really. And in those days, people just got up in the morning and they just drank. I mean, they'd start drinking about midday. And anyone who was a teetotaler was sort of looked at in a very sort of strange way. And weren't to be trusted if you didn't drink. Luckily, the world's moved on a bit, but, yes. So what was it like putting this book together? And you had the foreword was written by Marianne Faithfull, which is quite poignant, isn't it? I mean, I suppose, Yeah, I mean, Marianne was absolutely wonderful because obviously Marianne Faithfull knew some of these ladies in the book, but also, as Marianne says in the foreword, she wished she would have been born 20 years earlier because she would have preferred to have been around in the 1930s rather than the 1960s, which is quite a strange thing for a 1960s icon like Marianne to say, isn't it, really? But Marianne's taken it all. It's very, very funny.
And she was a great joy. I mean, it was very, very privileged to have her to write the forward to the book. It was absolutely wonderful. Taking it was hilarious. I mean, she knew some really, really tough cookies like Henrietta Moraes and Caroline Blackwood. I mean, these were women not to be messed with. They could literally kill a man with their tongue from 20 paces. Against him. Just a few words would be enough to castrate any man.
It sounds like this must have been an absolute joy to A, research, and B, to write. And presumably you probably have enough for a second volume, Darren, for this one. Yes,
there is. There's one I'm working on now called Bohemia Goes Pop, which takes you from the 1950s to the 1980s. So it's got Danny LaRue in it and all these sort of people, and Judy Garland, who were all hanging out in London in the 60s. And so the first book takes you from the 1920s to the 1950s. And the reason why it does that is because in the late 50s, the rock and roll takes off in Soho.
Yeah.
The skiffle takes over. And so what was Bohemia changes, because originally muses were inspired artists and poets to create work. But by the late 50s, muses inspired people to write rock and roll songs. So the idea of being an inspirational woman suddenly changes,
Yeah.
Now people are writing beautiful songs about you, but 20 years earlier, they've been painting beautiful pictures.
So everybody's hanging out in Bar Italia and look, but basically sort of like around the coffee machine.
Yeah, around the Two Eyes, which is a very, very famous coffee bar, wasn't it? The Two Eyes really kicked it all off. It's where the Beatles went into and played, and Cliff Richard was there, and Tommy Steele. And then a few doors down from that was another cafe called Heaven and Hell. And Heaven was on the ground floor and Hell was downstairs. And as the owner said to me, more people seem to want to go to Hell to drink coffee and stay upstairs in Heaven. And then from that, they made so much money, they opened up one of the first ever strip clubs in the West End at the same time as Paul Raymond did, which was called the Casino de Paris, which was a very, very famous strip club. So the stories of the coffee bars turning into rock and roll, then suddenly turn into strip clubs. It sort of takes you through the whole history of what was going on in the 60s.
Right. Well, Darren, I'm going to get you back on for that one, absolutely. If people want to, the book is called Queen of Bohemia and Other Misfits. Listeners, you can go onto our virtual bookstore, click on the link, click on the front cover, and it will be winging its way to you by a well-known delivery firm. Darren, if people want to follow you online, say lovely things, or say, when's the second book coming out, or getting more of your oeuvre, where can they find you?
Just go to queensofbohemia.com.
The book is called Queens of Bohemia. It's by Darren Coffield. Darren, it's been an absolute pleasure to kick off my Monday morning with you.
Thank you.